Welcome back to the DataStack Show. Today we're going to chat with Kevin Gervais. He's done a lot of interesting things with data. He's been working with data for a very long time. And the topic that we want to get into today with him is data design. And his philosophy is that before you start talking about any of the technology or data flows or infrastructure involved with data, you need to design the data itself. Really fascinating stuff. Kostas, I'm interested to know what led Kevin to this philosophy. You don't arrive at sort of a thesis like data design without having gone through probably a lot of painful experiences with data, which isn't uncommon. So I'm really interested to hear what his background is and where he sort of built the foundations of this theory.
Yeah, 100%. And I'd love to get into more detail about what this whole data design thing is. We keep forgetting that data has a shape, and we define this shape, and it has some properties where, again, we define these properties, but we don't chat about that much, mainly because we have like some other more primitive problems to solve. But when it comes to building like sustainable data infrastructure, it's inevitable to get into like this kind of design conversations and like how you model the world. And it becomes like a little bit more philosophical, let's say, but it's a very, very, very important aspect of working with data. And probably it's like the first time that we are going to discuss about that stuff. So I'm very, very excited.
Great. Well, let's jump in and chat with Kevin. Kevin, welcome to the DataStack Show. We're super excited to chat with you about all things data and specifically data design.
Great to be here. It's a good day to talk about data.
Always is, right? Every day. Well, give us a little background. I mean, you've been actually working with data since you were a child, literally, which is pretty wild. But just give us a little bit of your story and then tell us what you're doing today.
My life started once I got into data. No, I've always been really fascinated about organizing things. And I mean, we were chatting earlier about like even just growing up, we were using Macs that didn't have many games on them. And so back then, that's where I learned that we could use AppleScript to change the data inside of an app, and change by changing a couple things, you can make a stormtrooper replace the icon of what was some boring thing before, or you could use data to you change one piece of the data and you can change the sound of something. And so just learning that working with data can provide an immediate a gratification. You can actually see the impact of it instantly, has always fascinated me. And even just the progression of it, like if like someone, I think when I was getting into web design, when someone was asking us to build sites for organizing like embroidery, like shirts that would get embroidered, and they handed us a bunch of CDs or handed us a bunch of catalogs and said, go figure it out. And just being able to have like, it was realizing the satisfaction that you can get out of just organizing stuff has always been a passion. So yeah, I spent about 15 years doing that in the web side of things and working on e-commerce and different web projects, and then got into the telecom sector the last 8 years. And that's where you start to see, what does data look like, when it's really clean, or when it is standardized. And even then it's not beautiful. But just kind of seeing how have others dealt with some of these things and how do they organize their things has been fascinating. And I've been I've been privileged to have been exposed to so many different situations of how data can be organized, good and bad. So yeah, it's something I love talking about.
Yeah. One question on the telecom side of things. What kinds of data were you dealing with in telecom? In terms of format? I mean, is it sort of standard stuff, or like, I'm just interested to know in the telecom sector, what are the most sort of common types of data, and then maybe some of the more challenging types of data that you dealt with in telecom?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked me that. No,
we try to do
it's so personal. It's so personal. It's like, what data did you get exposed to? Oh, why?
We try to dive deep here on the data stack.
Man, this is a little personal. So I'm just gonna get emotional because it's gonna bring back memories. No, so the business we were in was trying to help telecom companies better serve their customers. So have a better life cycle with them. So instead of a random person from a call center talk to someone out of the blue that they've never met, we were working with a telecom or a member of them to make it so the person that sold somebody a phone or a tablet was the person that would follow up, and that would keep that relationship alive for years, and do that over text. So in order to have a great relationship like that, they had to have context. So you're working with, transactional records, purchase records, what packages are they on? How long has it been since they were talked to last? Notes, history. And then, so as we got into that, then we had to deal with conversational data. So you'd have to deal with, like, how do you determine sentiment when most of the APIs that are out there are trained on, like, say, email communication or well formatted sentences, but how do you look at the sentiment of somebody who's replying with acronyms over text, or an emoji, right?
Interesting.
And so we had to deal with a lot of data that, millions of records of data that you couldn't just apply these standards to. And then we got into POS data too, because the whole idea too, if you're trying to figure out how do you have a good conversation with someone, or is this conversation working, or is this script working, you have to tie it back to transactional data and bringing in not just, even in that scenario, we had to deal with the carrier would have certain data about a customer, only the products that they sold, but then the store that sold stuff to them would know about accessories and other stuff that the carrier doesn't know. And so we had to marry these two things, worry about duplicates. And so it accidentally ended up that we got into we put ourselves in the middle of all of these crazy data problems. And we had to actually solve a lot of them in order for us to do our job and have accurate reporting, right? Like, is this campaign working? You need to deal with all these different things. So it was a very interesting experience of having to be exposed to different formats. And also, I think the surprising thing out of that is just seeing that even these large companies that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on some of their systems, they don't have the cleanest data either, right? So everyone seems to, maybe dream of the day that, at someday I'm going to have everything all perfectly clean. It's not. No, I'm sorry. Like, it's not going to happen. It's just how much mess are you willing to have today? But there'll always be a mess.
Kostas's words ring in my ears all the time. Data in general is messy. Customer data tends to be very messy. I have one very clickbaity question for you. How did you deal with emojis and sentiment? Like, that's just a really interesting topic that I actually think is probably pretty relevant.
Well, emoji is data too, right? It's all converted into an ASCII code, or it basically is. So just being able to understand which code means what, but knowing also that which ones are inappropriate, which ones are inferring something very negative in some cases. Like you could have a very positive statement with a series of emojis after, and the emojis cancel out the meaning of the words. And so it was interesting. Like we in the heart of COVID, when that was happening, and a lot of these telecoms shut their stores right away. They since had opened them up, but like right as soon as COVID hit last year, everything shut down. 80% of them just shut their stores, and we were trying to understand what was the pulse of people of this, who were still buying, or when carriers were reaching out to customers, what were they saying? So in that respect, we came up with a model where we detected that certain phrases or series of emojis could dictate whether someone was afraid or joy, or were they sad, and then we compared that to prior periods to come up with a bit of an index of
interesting.
What is consumer sentiment during this time of crisis. And we did see a difference. We saw more, like whenever the stocks would dive, we saw an increase of fear in the way that people replied. Or I think what was fascinating actually, and when we got into helping people do outreach, right away we created this concept of standardized lists and standardized chat starters. And so since the beginning with that business, we were always able to know, because the chat starters in some cases never changed over the years. And so like for a given campaign to a given segment, this is what replies we should expect to see. And you'd be able to know this because we were kind of, it was all kind of standardized right at the beginning. And because we did that, that allowed us to come up with these patterns that you wouldn't otherwise get. Because if you weren't always asking the same question, you wouldn't be able to know, is the sentiment changing or not, right? Like if you're trying to measure sentiment just based on a random conversation that people can just type, the data is going to be all over the place. So I guess like the learning was that because we worried about being able to tie it back to specific baselines, right, like cohorts and scripts right at the beginning, that was an enabler for us to do some of these types of sentiment analysis, because we had something to go back to. We knew how people replied to that same question that people would ask, like, hey, is the phone you're using working out? Or how many questions about your phone? We knew how people replied to that the week before all this things to shut down. And then so when people reacted differently to that same question, it was like,
interesting.
Showed that there was interest. Yeah, some good learnings from that. But
so Kevin, what kind of infrastructure do you need in order to deal with such a diversity in the data that you are working with? Like how did you manage to work with all this data in a consistent way, right?
It took us a while to figure that out. I know I could tell you how not to do it. Well, I think actually what we had to deal with is what I think a lot of companies do have. It's the reality of a lot of folks, because our business started out where people would upload CSVs, like everyone knows what CSV is. Okay, so upload CSVs. They would give us structured data and we would upload it. And so at the time when we first started the company, it was like, oh, this is what we do. Somebody gives us a file that always looks like this. And so we will have columns in the database that are exactly the columns that we receive, no problem, right? And we did that for years. And then once people started giving us new types of files, we were like, oh, okay, I guess we got to jam these into these columns we had before. And then as we got into more and more types of data, it became messy, right? For us to figure out. I think the big thing that we came away with later is that we shouldn't have been so opinionated at the beginning of like having columns for specific type, we shouldn't always assume that there's like a column called subscriber ID.
Yeah.
Because maybe it's not a subscriber ID, right? Maybe it's an accounting ID, or maybe it's a Salesforce ID. And so I think the lesson out of that is we should have structured the data based on what type it was, right? Was it an identity? Was it a person record? Was it an org record? Or is it an event? Like what we end up moving to with the new architecture is move everything to an event-based CQRS model where you're event sourcing, right? So you're actually you're designing the domains of your data.
Yep.
And then we're using Axon, a DB and a bunch of other stuff to kind of force everything into events, and then that creates your model. But that was a lot of work and extremely difficult. And I think, if we had put the data into a more universal format at the beginning, like just realize that the names of our columns probably will matter, or like let's not always expect everything to be perfect integers in a column. We could have saved ourselves a lot of pain. And I think I think most businesses will, like, maybe they're not working with the same scale kind of data, but I think every business has a life cycle to the data that they have. Like the data that they collect at the beginning is different than the types of data that they collect 5 years down the road, right? They might change their billing system out. They might change out their CRM. They might want to change their CRM out in the future. And so I think just designing for agility, right, becomes really important.
Oh, that's a great point. Actually, and I'd like to hear like your opinion on that, because I think that models change not just because of ignorance at the beginning, right? It's also because at the end, we are building these data models to represent somehow reality, the business reality. And the business reality changes, right? Like if we think about, I don't know, like a company like RudderStack, like a startup, right? Like what RudderStack was like a year ago compared to what is today, like it's a completely different thing. And of course, this is also represented in the data models that we have. Could we have done like a much better job back then? Of course. But I think that even if we managed to do the best possible job in like modeling our world back then, just because we didn't know the world that well yet, would lead us like at some point like to change things. So that's why I think that what you said about building all these components with agility in mind and like being able like to change and adapt like your data, I think it's super important. So how do you do that? How do you build agile data models? Like what's like what principles drive this design?
That's a very good question. There's 17. Let me tell you all 17. No.
Too personal?
No, that's good. That's a good one. No, here's how I think about it. I think first, all a business is the flow of data. We sometimes it's either everything serves the data in the end. I mean, meaning like let's talk about like a website, for an example. You put a website up. If you create a design and you put a website up, what's the whole point of the site? Well, you want someone to call, right? Or you want someone to text in, or you want someone to fill out a form. Okay, once they fill out a form and maybe start an order, what is it now? It's data. So the point of actually a website is to trigger either a data connection to make a phone call, or a data connection to start a text, or capture some information and grab that as data, and then flow that to somewhere. That's really the sole job of the site, right? And especially if you're trying to, even if you're branding, if your site is just to help, provide, make people feel good about the brand, then how do you know if you're doing that? Well, then the job of the site is to collect data to see if you're accomplishing that goal, which is in that case, time on site. Are they interacting with the cool pieces that you've put in there that are branding elements? Are they watching the videos, etc.? So really, like, data is so important, and usually it's thought about as an afterthought. So I think just recognizing the fact that the flow, the capture, the transformation, and the flow of data is kind of what drives business, right? And remembering that I think is just important, because it helps us with the design process. That where you collect the data is not usually where you want it to end up, and then also just remembering that where it ends up today is not necessarily where you want it to end up tomorrow.
Yeah.
Most businesses go through a life cycle, right, or even an evolution in the systems that they use. So, so to answer your question, like how you go about designing for it, I think first you have to know your inputs. Like first, we have to be able to track all kinds of things, right? All kinds of events. We should be able to identify the types of things that we're tracking, and we should be able to move those things into different systems without a whole bunch of work. And what happens if you do want to switch systems? Because at some point you're going to want to switch systems out.
Yep.
You're in one CRM one day and you want to go to another. So I think just having those as inputs into the design process shows some of the variables that you have to consider, right? And so then, like, what I've noticed is that you actually can design your data. So in the web world, or even application design, there's a thought there of user interface design or user experience design, right? That's a function where everyone kind of understands, okay, I need to have a person draw up something that someone will interact with. Where should the button go, right? And it's very easy to start there and kind of only focus on that, because you get that immediate benefit, right? You can draft it, put it out there, and someone interacts with it, and you think your job's done. But data needs more design than an interface, because data integration, data transformation doesn't happen by accident. Like if you want your data to flow seamlessly between systems and to be future proof, you should design it as much, and I would argue more than, any graphical interface that you have. And so just like there's standards to user experience design, like don't put your close button in a random place off to the side of the screen that you have to like shake your phone in order to see. Like that'd be bad design. You should think of that. There's roles of there's similar things in the world of data, where there's like we know what a person looks like. A person, as an example, has a name. That name can change. They have a birth date, they have a death date, and they have probably an identifier attached to that. But that's a person. I mean, it's sad, but that's like a person is a name, an identifier, a birth date, and a death date.
Yeah.
Now, a person can then have identities attached to them. It can have traits attached to them, but those traits and identities can change over time, right? Names can change. Addresses can change. Even interests, right? personalities, gender, those sort of things. People could just, could change that. And so when you actually look at, how most CRMs treat that data, if you think that's going to be, your perfect data model, if they think of a person as first name, last name, gender, and I don't know, like address and phone number, and that's like a contact. It's no wonder you can see why that doesn't fit many situations. You end up with duplicates if somebody belongs to multiple organizations or et cetera. So I think going back to like, how do you fix it? It's extracting away, what's fixed and what could change. So a person, you might have, actually, you'd have a birth name. Actually, that's, if I think of what is an actual person, you have a given name, you have maybe a gender at birth, right? That might be on the record. And then you might have, again, a birth date and a death date, and that's it. Everything else is changeable. And then a person can be related to various places and reused. And if we design for things like that, I think we would end up with a better understanding of the relationships across our data, right?
Okay, and let's take like a real life situation. You have like an annoying salesperson who decides to go on your Salesforce and put a flag there just to remind them if they have visited like a contact or not, and they have like reached out to a contact or not, without consulting the data model, without reaching out to the person who is responsible for the data model or whatever. How do you deal with that? And what I mean is like the question is like, how do you deal with the human nature of like taking control of things to achieve what they want at the end, right? Because the problem that I have seen so far, like with all these things that have to do like with modeling and having like, like a very crystal clear, let's say, way of like understanding and distilled way of understanding like the world around us, is that the biggest enemy of this is like the rest of the people involved, right? Like they make mistakes, or they decide that I need something else, but I need it now, I'm going to change it.
Yes.
How do we deal with that? How do we deal with humans?
I think you should, like, first, I think we can build better interfaces, right? I think, like we recent situation, a client I'm working with had messy contact records and messy addresses, and they wanted to understand what are the patterns amongst the people, like, or is there a pattern to the customers living in a certain area? Like, do they seem to be getting more people from a certain area? And in order to do that, we looked at the data, and it was human entry error, where so many addresses would have like notes in them, dashes, weird quotes, and instead of having like a unit number, it was like right in the actual address. And we recently fixed, it was like 50,000 records last weekend, just to kind of, get to some sense of standardization. And then once we did, we provided instructions, and please, make things all in capitals and da 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 da. And even still, because it's human nature, to your point, someone, even if you do all the cleaning, right? Because this is like an extreme example where we actually cleaned everything, standardized everything, and we gave instructions. And even still, because the interfaces allowed for it, people would go in and just put they'd skip through it with just putting a period, or they would type the name of the city wrong. It wasn't on purpose. It's not because they like wanted to mess with the model. It was because the interface let them. Yeah. So I think ultimately, you need to know where you want to end up, but then to actually solve it, don't give people the ability to mess it up. So I think just being willing to to enforce that, right? And build interfaces that check for quality or check for duplicates. That's really the responsibility of a business, providing a tool to their staff. I would say it's humane. It's more humane. It's more empathetic for a business to put those filters in place to prevent issues ahead of time. And because when they don't, you're just going to frustrate everybody. You're actually going to you're going to get inefficiency. You're going to have bad reporting. You're going to now try and tell people something that you might even get angry at them. Why did you put space there? Why did you put a dot? And they actually can't help it because the interface is letting them. Yes. So I think first, just, being willing to fix the interface so you don't have bad data coming in. And then the other thing is, I would call it data management. I think the other thing that we're noticing is, even if someone were to go through all of the filters somehow and found their way to put bad data in, having a way of going through the warehouse and cleaning it automatically, just watching for issues, it is something that you can detect as a business and fix, and then push those things to the various sources once you've corrected it. Because knowing that there is probably going to be someone who will find a way around all the controls you put. Yeah. But don't accept it, right? Meaning,
there always
a lot
is.
of people throw their hands up. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I have a good example that it's going to resonate very well with Eric. One of the most frustrating things that happen when you build a new product is when your developers, they start signing up to test things, right? So you have to get into this situation where you want to start tracking signups, of course, but at the same time, you have people who are signing up that you don't want to include in your measurements because they're your developers, right? And you have to clean this data, of course. And at one day you come and they're like, listen, guys, we have to fix this problem, okay? So from now on, you are going to be using a specific format of email that you'll be using, so I can go and easily filter it. Well, guess what? Everyone agrees on that, but it's not happening at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds, it is. I mean, it's hilarious because it sounds like such a simple problem to solve, but there's always an edge case, right? To your point, Kevin, people always figure out a way around it. And that's actually true. It's really interesting because just thinking back to some of my previous experiences, the same is actually true for direct-to-consumer products, right? If you think about a business creating a user experience or user interface for their own employees or staff to do their job, someone's always going to find a way to sort of shortcut the process. And the same problem actually applies with, let's just say, a consumer mobile app, right? You try to set these guardrails for onboarding and activation, and inevitably someone figures out a way to do something weird that creates a poor experience both for them as a user and then also, the business who's trying to optimize the experience. And so it is.
Well, even just to that point, if you accept it, so first it's accept there's it's going to happen. But previously, to solve for this was really, really hard, right? This is something that's why I think a lot of people would throw their hands up and it happens, right? But
right, it's almost accepting a margin of error, or sort of, and I've actually seen this before. It's just okay, well, our reporting is probably just going to be X% off because there are these sort of edge cases, right? And so fine, we'll just deal with that.
But accepting that sometimes, having those, margin of error exceptions is it really ruins the reporting too. Like even especially when if you're trying to understand like adoption patterns in your app, and you've got a bunch of employees that slip through the cracks, right? That all of a sudden their interactions are now being tracked, right? It throws all of your understanding off, because maybe those employees are doing things with the app that no other user is doing, or maybe they are going in trying to look at one thing and then leave, and then so your metrics are like, oh no, we've got a massive churn problem.
Sure.
Like it could waste huge amounts of money, time, and energy because the reporting is a bit off, quote unquote.
Totally.
Right?
Or time to activation is another one. If you have people who are very familiar with an app and they go through and activate very quickly to do a demo or walk through or test something, but they already know the user flow ahead of time that they're testing or whatever, like your activation time can be skewed significantly by people who complete the process really, really fast, right? Where, so then you have a huge derivation that is pulling the average way down. And so you think that people are actually onboarding to the product way faster than they are.
Or I see this all the time on web, especially for people who have sign up processes, let's say in an app, and they'll have a bunch of their users will go to the web. They might Google, if they've got users that log into their app, right? And maybe it's a B2B SaaS product, or even consumer app product, but it's like you go to the website to log in. There's a bunch of those users that are known customers, right? They're known identities, and but yet they often are showing up in Google Analytics reports or things as just regular visitors, right? So you could be looking at a bunch of reports, and if you're not segmenting your data properly, if you're not accounting for the fact that this stuff happens and filtering it, then it can throw off all these other metrics. So someone could look at the reporting and go, wow, our campaign's working, when really 80% of those are all just people going to the site to log in. Well, you really should actually be removing all of those visitors from your reporting, because they're not marketing visitors. They are like known visitors. And so if you're marketing trying to figure out if your campaign's working, like maybe it isn't, right? Like maybe most of your visits are just like people who will come back anyway. And so figuring out when to flag these things and how to filter them at the point of collection, I think is really important.
Totally.
Because I've seen this actually in a situation where, someone is thinking they have a massive churn problem, when really it was just a data problem. Like they were measuring churn improperly, or they didn't know how to measure it. And so maybe they were going based on number of unique identities in the system. But what they really should be doing is looking at people who were billed and go from that as the source of truth. So like sometimes it's just knowing, like changing your source to power a certain metric, or accounting for the fact that you might have duplicates. Like there is sometimes a data solution, right? To first figure out what your baseline is at, right? Because it can completely change your decision making, and you might invest in fixing a problem that actually isn't a problem, right?
Quick question. You mentioned a bit earlier that the company can establish, let's say, like the right mechanism there to figure out when like issues with data and around quality specifically like happen. Can you give us a little bit more context around that? Like what kind of mechanism like a company can use to detect that, for example, dates, not dates, sorry, the addresses problem that you mentioned, right? Like how
addresses is a big problem. So what I usually start with is, I mean, there's been I have more recent theses on this since, but where I started from which I think is a good baseline, is even if you only service a certain market, right? A certain area of your state, or maybe, you're only in US or you're only in Canada. You should store your data in ISO format, or if you look at Smarty Streets or some of these other APIs that are available, there are these like international APIs that show you what an international address should look like, right? Like, don't store things in a way that says, okay, like zip, province, city. What if it's a rural route? Like, if you ever look at a rural address, sometimes it's like, County Road 46, rural route 3, intersection of this. Like, you can't just kind of assume that everyone can fit into this like address 1, address 2, city, state, province, or city, state, country. So thinking of things of like, localities, administrative areas, sub-administrative areas, accounting for the fact that maybe there's not a real address and you have to have latitude and longitude. So if you can but you don't have to invent these things. Like, these models already generally exist in certain APIs, like, again, Smarty Streets is a good one, or you could look at ISO standards. And if you stored your stuff in that format, then and start to create structure to like where the stuff should go, it's like putting it in the right filing cabinet, right? So at least you can know where to look. And then once you've done that and you have the right data model, and you don't have to overthink it. Like, I think just like, starting with these well-known international formats is a good start. Then so let's say that you're doing that in Postgres as an example, or SQL Server, or some sort of database. Then you can put things like Hasura or Prisma or something on top of that database, which gives you triggers, like on update or on insert, or on deletion. You could trigger little micro functions, right, which could be hosted somewhere. And those micro functions could be things that know that bad data could make its way in accidentally. And at the point of insertion, then start a transformation step that then extracts the unit number from the first part of the address. Like, maybe some people put in 200-1 Main Street, where 200 is the unit number. We'll pull that out, if you notice there's a dash, and convert that to unit 200 and put that in the unit field. Like, so I think, like, from a tool perspective, previously to do that would have been a lot of work, right? But now, because you can basically have your data go into a nice warehouse, you can have an API layer for free to sit on top of that to look for changes. And then that can trigger effectively free functions, which can clean up these little patterns. You can actually make the data clean itself, right? And hopefully, force it into a standard format, and then push that to the various places.
So what are we talked about addresses, and you said that they're like a very common source of issues with data. What other issues you have seen, like more commonly, like together with addresses? What else you have seen there?
Oh, I think person records like jump out, where or if you're using something like Salesforce, where I think a lot of people where they where they don't set things up, and it causes issues, is they don't put like unique identifiers. They don't similar contacts. And so if you have a person that is across multiple accounts, like the same contact is in 3 different accounts, as an example.
Yeah.
In Salesforce, you should be having a field to store like the unique identifier. And that way you can start to tie together in the future, that these contacts are related to each other, and then you can basically set up rules to like sync the thing. So I think one of the biggest issues I see is just duplicates, right? And then the second piece is just the quality of what's in a name, right? You'll see a lot of folks will put either names, a first name field, or they don't they put the first name and last name in the first name field and keep the last name blank. So like just what gets put in the fields, I think is often an issue. And then even just formatting, I see this all the time from like marketing cloud data, but you'll have some contacts that are all caps and some are capitalized and some are all small. And that would be how it goes out in an email, right? So you usually be seeing this stuff in the data side. And because that actually will reduce your click rate and could cause more opt-outs if you're saying, hey, Fred, and it's all caps. So, like capitalization, putting the right thing in the right field, and tracking that these three different contacts might be the same one. I would say are like the top ones.
Yeah, actually, that's like a very interesting problem, which has to do with identity in general, and especially now that we are using like so many different SaaS applications, which each one imposes like a data model on their own. Like when you use Zendesk, they have their own way of representing what the user is. When you are using Salesforce, the same. Your marketing tools, probably they have a little bit of a different. And of course, like the people involved there are also different, right? So what's your suggestion on like how to deal with this problem, which is inevitable, right? Like that's how life is. Like we have all these different systems.
Yeah, I think at its most extreme, the best one that I've seen that does a good job of this is Adobe Identity. I mean, it's normally used by very large orgs, but I think most orgs can learn from that, even if they do a portion of what they do. Adobe Identity says, and you can just see all this from their development docs as inspiration, but they look at everything's an identity that's attached to a person, and the identities can change. So there's you have an identity record, and you can set what is that type of identity, and is it a permanent identity? Is it a ticket, like a Zendesk identity? You can basically come up with your own, like, what is the type of identity that this is, and then you can attach it and detach it from a record, from a contact at any time. It's a little bit overkill for most people. I think if you just were to simplify it, just keeping a record of relationships of, this is a list of identities, and then you have a table that says, okay, this identity is related to this record. Having that somewhere, it can go a long way to at least, keep track of these things. Instead of assuming that you'll always be able to correlate them to each other, like just creating this type of relationship mapping is, an easy way to keep track of it. And yes, sorry, go ahead.
No. I find very interesting what you're saying. I'm just trying to think of like, who is managing these identities? Like who is responsible at the end? Because what we are doing here is we are trying to solve this problem by adding another level of indirection, let's say. So we say, let's create like this concept of identity. And instead of mapping Zendesk to Salesforce, Zendesk to Marketo, and Marketo with Salesforce, let's go and do Marketo identity, Salesforce identity, Zendesk identity. And if we do that, of course, then all of them are like mapped, right? But still, like someone has to manage like this mapping to the reference identity that we're creating on this identity management system. So who does that?
Oh yeah, I don't know if that role exists yet. It's like, I think it's what we'll find. I think we'll find though is over time that like data quality will become a function of a business, right? And I think it should. I mean, it's unfortunate that that's required, but it is a role that is, realistically required today to kind of manage the fact that this is going to always occur. And the ones that do invest in managing this are the ones that are going to get way more out of their base because they can infer things that the others can't. And I think, just like as a quick example, like even with phone numbers, was working with a bunch of records today, just a fintech trying to do some outreach to customers over text, and the records provided from the marketing system, some have pluses in front of them, some have brackets, some are just too many digits, some are missing digits. So that affects your ability to reach people, right? If you're expecting the format to always be clean, we would have rejected 30 to 40% of the records. And so you'd be marketing to less people. Once we were able to standardize all that in an international format, now you're reaching 80 something or 90 something percent of the records that were provided because we were able to standardize it. But like, if you don't put someone in that role of a responsibility to ensure quality, you actually could be really hampering your ability to do marketing or to infer things, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think I was jumping back to Adobe. It's such an interesting point. And Kevin, having been a past user of some of the Adobe Marketing Cloud products, I think they get a bad rap for being a huge, expensive, monolith, and in many ways they are. But it's really powerful technology. And I think it's I just loved your comment of sort of looking at their developer docs for inspiration. I think the challenge that like a lot of companies face is, one, it's unattainable from a cost perspective. And then two, the question Kostas asked is, who manages sort of the central identity? Well, in the Adobe world, it's Adobe, right? And so you're locked in, and it creates a huge amount of inflexibility, which I think is very problematic in many ways.
And I think most people should manage that in their own warehouse. Now, the question is, okay, what does that look like, right? What's the schema for that? And what's the, like what's the turnkey way for them to manage their own identity system in their own environment? And, I think there's a lot of folks trying to get solutions in the market to solve that. It might still take some time, right? Like, I don't know that this is something people can just buy an out of the box thing today and it will just work, right? Magically to solve all their identity issues and run in their own environment. I think it's only become clear that this is a problem that has to get fixed. So it's going to take some time before anyone can do this. I think the, you could start in a simple way, right? You could basically have a content, you could have a table that just stores like really hard coded things, like have a column for like, here's an ID, like here's your main ID, and you have a column for Zendesk ID, you have a column for Salesforce ID, you have a column for Marketo ID, and then kind of just track that. And that might be, it's like a shortcut, right? Where you're not trying to manage a whole identity layer, but you're at least trying to map the relationship that these three IDs are all tied to the same contact. That's like, it's just a little step up from what someone might do on their own. I mean, if you really want to cheat, you could just have a contact record. Like when we talk about person record, you could have a person record with some extra columns in it. And like, if you don't want to get into the whole relationship mapping piece, just add some columns for these different identities. And that will allow you to eventually tie them together, right? But just like having them stored somewhere is better than it just, being all up in the air and hoping that you can always match based on email address. because that's usually what people do, right? They'll go and they'll try and just like match on
Yeah.
that, but maybe Salesforce has someone's work email, and
Sure.
then HubSpot has somebody's Gmail. So like you won't really be able to match them if you just think that you're always going to be able to go based on email. So but yeah, I think there's shortcuts. Like to solve this, I don't think you have to jump right ahead to this, perfect world identity management thing. I do, yeah, I would agree with you that relying on a vendor to hold all of those identities is dangerous, because what if you want to move, right? What if you want to take control of that? You're not going to be able to get that perfect export
Yep.
of all the Adobe IDs that they've created.
Sure. Yeah.
They do make it easy, but also like Adobe, the Adobe identity is kind of an overkill solution for most companies that don't have that type of complexity. So
yeah,
it's definitely something people should take on themselves if they
for
can.
sure. Well, you answered the question. We're at the buzzer here. Brooks is telling us that we're at the buzzer. So we need to close the show out, but I was going to ask you what's the starting point, but I couldn't agree more that the starting point is actually just beginning to tie together some of the basic pieces of unique identifiers from the various places in your stack to build a foundation for that unified profile in the warehouse. And even if you do the basics, like you said, where you're literally just sort of mapping the unique IDs across tools, is such a useful foundation to build for the future. Kevin, one thing we didn't talk about that we discussed before the show is you have built some unbelievably fast and SEO performant websites, literally just using technology to sort of push pages to the first page of Google. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but would you come back on the show and can we break down the stack for, sort of the latest, greatest SEO performant website stack, especially relative to the data piece? Would love to have you come back on the show if you'd be willing.
Yeah, that'd be great. And especially because, to be able to do those cool things with fast web, experiences, the data model really is important. Like you need to put your data in a certain format. You need to have a certain flow working, because that you have to make it so the browser doesn't do any of the work. And the reason why things are slow is because sites generally 99-ish percent, 98% of the web works this way, where they put all the work on the browser. Someone has to, they go to the site and then it has to make a whole bunch of, stops to get all the information that the user might be asking for. And all those things take time. And there's a whole bunch of calculations and work done by the browser to present it. And so if you want the browser to do no work and just present information instantly in under half a second, the data model needs to be pretty clean on the back end to make that possible. So, but yeah, once you get there, the benefit is you can do some pretty cool stuff. So yeah, happy to walk through like how someone could go about setting that up.
Love it. Well, that was a great preview. We'll have Kevin back on the show. Kevin, awesome discussion. I learned a ton. Thank you so much for giving us some time, and we'll talk with you again soon.
Yeah, thanks. It was great to chat about all things data.
It always is. Fascinating conversation. My big takeaway was when Kevin said, all a business is the flow of data. I haven't really chewed on that statement enough to know whether I have a strong conviction about it, but it was very thought-provoking. And in many ways, I think makes sense. When you sort of break a business down into its component parts, even the conversation that maybe a salesperson is having with a prospect, the content of that conversation is data. And so that was very thought-provoking to me. So I think that's probably what I'll be chewing on this week, is that statement. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's of course like super interesting. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had with him about modeling and abstractions around data. I think what I'll keep from this conversation is that in order to be as correct as possible, or be able to have the right mechanisms in place to monitor quality or like react in issues, you need to have a good abstract model of how your world and how your company and how all the functions and your interactions with the customers are going to be. That's what I'm going to keep. I think it's a very, it's a piece of wisdom that we took from him. And I think it's a great advice for every engineer out there that before you start implementing, like spending time in designing things and thinking about why things should be organized in a certain way. It's something that super important, and it comes with maturity. I mean, it's not a coincidence that he had to mess with so many issues related to data to come to this conclusion at the end. So yeah, that was I think a very important part of our conversation, and that's something that I definitely think about and keep.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for joining us on the DataStack Show, and we will catch you on the next episode.